right, so again, we're going to be down here at Configure. We want to go to Configure Roles and select the role that you want to take a look at. And let's take a look at validations. So the two main validations that we're going to be dealing with regards to authorizations would be these two that you see, authorization min-max and the authorization must be approved. So most of you are really familiar with this already. We can choose to enforce the validation, which means if we trip that validation, it's going to be thrown. And then we also allow, based on the role, the ability to either override the validation or not override the validation. So as you can see from the settings here, we are going to enforce the validations, but we are going to allow an override in this particular case. The other thing that we really want to take a look at, because we will be talking about some of the reports and how we can use one or two of the reports in kind of chasing down any issues with authorization validations. So two in particular, again, by role that you would want to ensure that by role you can run those, would actually be the service variance and the service variance utilization. So we will actually be using those two reports today in this training session. So again, you would want to at least allow the role in question to be able to run those reports. So again, Validations tab and the Reports tab. All right, so the first place that we really want to take a look at is actually UBIT authorizations. So set up a couple of views here throughout. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one particular client that we're going to be dealing with. So I've selected this particular view, and we're filtering to these two services. Anybody who's not as familiar with the search grid at this point, you have a multitude of filters here. You can actually select current, yes or no. So I am actually looking at current authorizations by selecting current yes. So let's go ahead and take a look at this authorization. You'll notice that the items are shown line by line, which includes multiple service lines per auth. So case in point, let's go ahead and take a look at the in-home skill building here. This is IHSB. Some of you are familiar with that service. So you'll notice this is really just replicating what we see in the search grid. Again, some of this is going to be familiar to some of you. So in chronological order, we actually have this broken down by date range. So this becomes really important when you're wanting to validate weekly maximums, monthly maximums, total unit maximums based on a particular date range. This is something you would see really probably with IDD service providers. Another situation where you may see multiple services up under one authorization in mental health. You may have bundled services, especially with outpatient services. That's another situation where you would have multiple services falling up under one authorization. So again, this may look really familiar to some, to others this may be kind of a new idea. So I'll kind of mention the first thing here, the approved checkbox. Really, really important, and that really links into the must be approved validation that we took a look at earlier. So if we're enforcing that validation and we have this selected for approved, we will be validating against whether or not the authorization has been approved. And one other thing that you'll notice here, the authorization level validation. This can be a little confusing to people, but if we want to actually validate the total number of units, again, we would either have bundled services falling up under the one authorization or services, the same service broken up over date ranges falling under the one authorization. Authorization level validation would actually authorize the unit, would actually validate, the unit maximums at the authorization level. So you'll notice that I've actually put here 4,275 units at the max total units. Typically, you would want to put that actually up top if I have, in this case, broken down services by date range, because I want the system to actually validate the total max units for the whole authorization, so as a whole. You'll notice, though, that I actually have the weekly maximums placed at the service level. So that's really the preferred method. Typically, again, in this scenario, we would be authorizing at the authorization level validation for the total number of units, and we would be validating for weekly or monthly here at the service level. So again, we have the weekly units broken down down below. All right, let's take a look at that other authorization for personal care. So this will be a simpler authorization. You know, this is the typical one service to one authorization scenario. This is a situation where we typically would not be using the authorization level validation. You know, we just have the one service sitting on the one authorization. We have our weekly and or monthly totals, your daily maximum put here at the service level, and then we would actually just plug in our total maximum authorized units down below. This is another area where some people get confused. We see year and total. Year in this case would actually be the calendar year. So most of the time, for most agencies, you're actually plugging in the total maximum units under the total, or if you're validating against the authorization level validation, you're putting it at the max total units versus the max year units. Minimums, same idea. You're plugging in a basic minimum required before the system will actually fire a validation. All right, so let's go ahead with that, just kind of some of the basics of authorizations, kind of the control points for validations with regards to authorizations. Let's move on. So let's take a look at a scenario of actually writing notes. This is really a scenario that approvers would find themselves in. Note writers would actually maybe be in this sort of situation. So again, I've set up a view ahead of time. Let's go ahead and select that view. So for this view, I actually have personal care weekly signed unapproved. So in this scenario, I'm considering that I'm the approver. I'm coming in. I've set my view. I'm wanting to look for all notes that have been signed that are eligible and unapproved. So this is my way of actually getting at those notes that I need to now approve. Again, you know, typically most of you guys are kind of restricting this by date range. If you have a particular billing week, something of that sort, this would, of course, fall in line with your authorization. That was another thing that I really should mention. Let me kind of go back real quickly. If I open up this authorization, starting day of week, that's also a really important function. Starting day of week, if you don't see anything here, the system will actually default to Sunday as the starting day of the week. So if you actually put something there, whatever day of the week that you actually specify, that's actually a really important control point with regards to how the system will be calculating units and how those validations are going to be thrown. It also will have an effect on some of the reporting with regards to service variance, reporting with regards to utilization. So let me jump right back to notes. This is, again, that scenario where I'm looking at that particular week. I'm looking for any of the notes that I need to approve. So this is probably a scenario some of you have found yourselves in. I'm actually going to go ahead and try to approve this note And let's kind of see what we get here. Let's go ahead and process. We're going to approve for billing and for payroll. All right, I'm getting a couple of extra validations here. But buried in all those validations, you'll actually find this really important one. I'm sure you guys are getting a ton of validations. But here's one very important one: service authorization maximum weekly units exceeded. So if you're getting that particular message, the question may be, well, this provider was able to sign this. Why am I actually getting this particular message? So really from here, one method that you can follow is actually to go to the reports desktop. And so if we actually go down here to reports, we can get a better understanding of what's going on. So for a weekly scenario, I'm, getting an exceeded units validation based on the weekly total. I'm actually going to go to reports, billing, and service variance. All right. So let's run that report for that particular client. I only want to look at the unexpired authorizations. I'm going to take a look again. Just go ahead and filter by service. I'm going to take a look at that particular week. Something's going on with that week, and I want to get a better idea of what's going on. I'm going to run that report and see what we get. All right, so I can see here that based on the service variance report, I have 100 units for the weekly authorized maximum. I, however, have in process 104. So I am actually over by 4 units. So it's a really good use of this report to really just kind of narrow down what's going on here. So let's go back to the Notes desktop. And for this, I'm actually going to select another view. So let's take a look at that whole week and get a better understanding of what's going on. So here we go. We actually have 5 notes. This particular individual for that time period. It looks like, okay, there's the one that I had signed that I'm trying to approve, and sure enough, if we add those units up, I am over by 4 units by 1 hour. So at this point, of course, using the tasking system inside of OnTarget, you could send that task to the employee, have them make the changes. I can actually make that change right now. And I'm actually going to change this last note to 11 a.m. I know I've got 100 units to work with. So now, with that adjusted, I should be able to go back to that note I was trying to approve. And I should be able to approve it without that particular validation being thrown. I'm sure we'll still get a slew of other validations, but I should not see that weekly maximum, and sure enough, I don't see that anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and actually override again. Here we go. Here's a perfect example of being able to override that validation, yes, and continue processing. And now I have that note approved. All right. So the last scenario that I want to take a look at is actually with scheduling. I know that we do get this scenario quite a bit, especially with regards to services and lock note on scheduling. Anytime that you actually have the ability to override, again, this is going to be role specific. But let's take a look at this scenario, especially for schedulers, for program managers. Let's go ahead. I've got another view set up. Let's take client 15 IHSB schedule, and let's go ahead and take a look at that. All right, so I've got some time scheduled here. So one thing that I do want to actually call to your attention is the validate. This is something that I think is often not used, but I can actually validate a schedule based on my filter settings. Here I actually have the filter settings set based on a view. I'm going to actually validate this, and then it's going to ask for a date range. So for that particular individual, let's say I want to validate for the month of September. Let's see what we get. Again, we're getting a lot of other validations thrown in here, but you will see, again, at the end of every one of these, we have, there it is, service authorization, maximum weekly units exceeded. All right. So that's actually going to be daily. So someone obviously did an override on that particular maximum weekly units exceeded validation. So again, if you take a look at your validations per role, how that's set up, if you enforce the validation, it's going to throw it, and if you do not allow the override, it's never going to get scheduled. If you actually enforce that for the scheduling role or for program manager, whoever's doing the scheduling. All right, so let's actually go ahead and just try to schedule for that last week in September. All right. We've got our client 15. Try to schedule this for in-home skill building. And of course I can link to a status here. I'm going to use my recurrence pattern and choose specific dates. Again, we're getting validations, but buried in those validations, there we go, service authorization maximum total units exceeded at this point. It's a little different. We're not getting the weekly at this point. We're actually getting the service authorization maximum total units exceeded. So I'm going to actually go ahead and cancel that out. I'm not going to override. If I wanted to override, of course, I would click on the top checkbox and hit Override Validation. I use this as an example because this is a really good opportunity to, again, go back to reports. And we can use another report to our advantage in kind of tracking down what the real issue is. So again, we have exceeded units. Let's go to billing. Let's go to service variance utilization. This time we're going to take the utilization report because we have a service maximum for the whole authorization being tripped. Let's take a look at this one. Again, U for unexpired. Let's take a look just at that in-home skill building. And for this, I know the authorization period for this individual for in-home skill runs from 11/1/2015 to 10/31/2016. So let's just take a look at what's going on with that authorization. Sure enough, units remaining, 0. So I have a lot of in-process units here. Have quite a few build units from the previous time period. But in-process units, you'll notice I actually have a really high total right here for 11/1 through 5/31. I have 488 in-process units. So just to clarify, in-process units could actually be a couple of things. It could be saved notes, signed notes, any notes that have not been billed, any note that does not have an invoice associated, right? Another thing would actually be scheduled events that are tying up those units. So I can actually take this information, obviously 0 units remaining, the system is firing that correctly. In-process units, I'm going to investigate this a little bit further. I could take a look at in-process units 488 for 11-1 through 531. That seems really high to me. So my suspicion is that is with scheduling. So let's go ahead and go back to scheduling. Let's change this to the grid view. And I actually do have another view set up. And I've actually called this client 15 schedule no note. The reason why I've set it up that way, I actually have set up the linked to note no set for the linked to note filter. And I've also set that for a date range of 11-1 to 531. So as you can see, for the in-home skill building 11-1 through 531, I have 61 records that do not have notes associated. So again, I'm really just tying up those units. I'm consuming those units based on the scheduled events. So from here, I can make a decision. I can either change these scheduled events to non-bill codes just to keep that intact for historical purposes, or I could just go ahead and delete these. If I know this was so far back, I don't need these scheduled events anymore, I'm actually going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead, select the top one. I'm going to go all the way down to 1/2/2016. I can actually Control-Shift and click the last record, and I can actually select all of those records in between and go ahead and hit Delete Selected. All right. And I could verify that, go back to the reports. Obviously, my numbers would change. Let's try that again. Let's try actually scheduling for the 25th through the 1st. And we should no longer get validations for exceeded units. And let's double check that. And there we go. I'm good with overriding the rest of those validations, but we're no longer getting the exceeded units. So one other thing that I do want to mention is actually with services. And for anybody especially who is new to OnTarget, if you're just getting started using the scheduling desktop, just make sure if you actually go to Services, Note Configuration, really important here, let's take a look at that in-home skill building. You'll notice Lock Note on Scheduling is actually selected. So here we go. If we tooltip over that, check this box if you wish to have the header fields on your notes locked. So that is actually requiring a schedule link to be created before the note can be created. PC, we, however, do not have that note locked to schedules. So I make mention of that really because that can also be a cause of exceeded unit validation. Especially if you have implemented schedules and you're not locking the note to schedules, you will actually, in fact, run the potential risk of double consuming units. If note writers are allowed to go outside of the scheduled item to write notes, you would be double consuming units against the authorization. All right, guys. Well, that concludes the authorizations and validations training. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to email those to Skylar or to me. And thank you again for joining our session today. Bye-bye.